Hello and welcome to Kickback Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Luke. This podcast is your place to get the tools and knowledge necessary to navigate the world of health and wellness. So kick back, let's talk science. This is good content. This stuff has gone crazy. We'll jump into it. Let's dive in. Let's do a little science. I'm going nitty gritty science right now.
I've been looking forward to this.
Kind of going on a little bit of a tangent.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
The information we discuss in this podcast is not meant to be taken as medical advice. It is simply informative. We're not affiliated with any organization or institution, just a few guys talking science and having fun. It better be good enough for you, Joe.
That was a pretty weak one, dude.
That's good enough for Joe. We miss you, Joe.
Yeah, Joe.
Where the fuck are you? Well, thanks for tuning in to another Kickback Science episode.
Yeah.
It's just not the same
Welcome
today
back.
because Joe decided not to show up. So,
It's a vacant chair there.
yeah, we just got a vacant chair. He's the editor of the podcast, but also such an important voice. And
Brings the humor.
Yeah. So we miss you, Joe. I missed you, Reed.
Hey, I missed you too,
How you
Dr.
doing?
Luke. Pretty good. Pretty
Yeah.
good.
It's just us
Excited.
today.
Excited about the topic today.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I'm excited too. This is one topic. Well, I'd say this is like the one topic. This is the topic of the Kickback Science Podcast episode. So for today's episode, we are going to just dive into all things muscle. So like, what is muscle? We're going to get deep into the cell, like talk all anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and I'm going to try to stay as surface level as possible. So
I'll try to bring it back.
Yeah. You just direct me back to the surface when I go too deep. But I'm going to convince you that muscle is the most important organ in the body. Yes, for all you neuro folks, I said muscle is the most important organ in the body in terms of health. And so we're talking all things muscle. Then the next episode is going to be, okay, now you know the importance of muscle. I hope you're convinced. And we're going to talk about how the hell do you build
Build it
muscle.
up. Yep.
Okay.
All right. Let's get into what muscle is. Just like the basics of it.
Okay. So let's dive
Dive.
deep into let's dive deep. I'm going to use the dive deep. Let's dive deep into our body, and we're going to take a peek into the muscle. So when you think of muscle, like an easy way to think of it is, this organ that helps us move. So our muscle is a group of cells that are kind of bound together, and they work with each other to change the angle of our joints. Now, this is the most simple way you can think about a muscle. And so we have all these different cells, these different muscle fibers that are their own cells. And they connect with each other and then connect with a tendon that inserts onto a bone. So at the ends of each muscle is a tendon that inserts to the bone, and then the muscle will contract to shorten the angle of that bone. And that's really what most people think of muscle as, is like, this organ that helps us move. But there's so much more to that. Now, in order to talk about the benefits of muscle and like how it influences the rest of our health, I'm going to bore you with a little bit of anatomy and physiology, okay? So the way a muscle works is it's unlike any other cell in our body. Literally, like, it is the most unique type of cell. We often think of cells as these like perfect circular spheres. A muscle is like a long straw, or like think of it as like a strand of hair. A muscle is like a strand of hair. And that's one cell. It's like a whole strand. Within that strand of hair, we have these contractile proteins or contractile elements called actin and myosin. So you remember this from physiology, actin and myosin. So myosin is this big old beefy protein that has these, think of it as like your forearm, and myosin's like your hand. So your hand is very mobile and when you contract your wrist, you can shorten that myosin and you kind of pull along, if you're with me on that analogy.
Yeah.
So a myosin is
I used to
forearm.
think it as like Velcro. You kind of just like pull it out and then put it back in, kind of like it sticks to the Velcro and then pulls out.
Ooh, I like that, how myosin sticks to the actin.
Yep.
Yeah, so we've got our myosin heads, and they are what provides the energy to shorten the muscle. Each myosin has a bunch of heads on it. Like a myosin molecule has tons of different, like your wrist basically. And each of those heads is constantly looking to attach to an actin protein. Actin, there's 6 actin molecules that surround one myosin. So they kind of surround this myosin in a circle. And then those hands of the myosin molecule will grab onto an actin, and then it will shorten it, or it'll cock back, like you said, like, so it'll latch on like Velcro, and then it'll pull along actin to shorten itself. So you can kind of think of it as if you're like crawling through. I just imagined this in my head. This is an analogy that I thought of before.
Off the dome.
Ooh, how can we make this
Game of Thrones?
Game of Thrones. Okay, so King's Landing, right? When people had to sneak into King's Landing, they had to go through those like tunnel systems.
The crypts or the crypt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they had to go through these tunnel systems, but you can't stand up straight in parts of these. You have to kind of crawl down and pull yourself along, like almost like a sewer drain. Well, you're the myosin in this example, and you're latching on and kind of pulling yourself through these drain areas which resembles what myosin and actin are doing. That's about the best Game of Thrones example.
Think of any else.
What a shitty example. But essentially, I bring that up because it's important to note that your myosin and actin are working in this way to shorten your muscle. And then that we'll get into, when you grow muscle, you're adding these components to your cell to help strengthen the cell, increase the size of the cell. So when you have a better capacity of myosin to bind actin, you have a better capacity to shorten that muscle cell. Now that requires energy though. So it requires ATP for myosin to detach, or that Velcro to detach from the actin to go through that cycle. So when you contract muscle, it uses up a ton of energy just in that process alone. And that process doesn't occur without the nervous system's influence. So each of your little fibers is connected to what's called a motor unit. So a motor unit is what's called an alpha motor neuron. So it's one neuron that's kind of pushing out from our nervous system, and it's got all these finger attachments that will latch on to individual muscle cells. And so one motor neuron innervates a ton of different muscle fibers. But and this depends on the organ. I mean, in your eye, a motor neuron can innervate like one independent muscle fiber, because our eyes are actually like the most sensitive and tactile and precise muscles or organs in our body. And so we can move our eyes with like the most precise movement. Your fingers are second to that, and they're not even close. Like your eyes, it's crazy. Like us humans have this perfect ability to track with our eyes, and it's because each motor unit, so our nerves, innervate such a small amount of those muscle fibers so we can control the muscle contraction, versus, let's say, with your quads, for example. So your quadriceps muscles in the front of your thigh, there's 4 of them there. They're big, beefy muscles. A motor unit, or the nerves that innervate those muscles, will latch onto like 1,000 different fibers. So when the motor unit signals for a contraction, all of those fibers contract at the same time. It's what you call an all or none principle. There's no in between.
Yeah.
And so put this into context. If you had 1,000 muscle fibers in your eye that were innervated by one motor unit,
just jacked eyes.
Yeah, you'd fire that motor unit, and then every single one of those muscle fibers contracts, moving that muscle. And so you've got all these different motor units that are communicating with the muscle fibers to cause that fiber to contract. And I'm kind of painting this background picture that will make more sense as we get into it, but I want to make sure that all this background information is here as we start describing things, because you get into different types of motor units and different types of muscle fibers. So I talked about a muscle fiber, the muscle cell itself, and how it's innervated by these nerves or these motor units. Well, there's different sizes of these motor units or these nerves, and it happens to be that the smaller motor units innervate what's called type 1 muscle fibers. Type 1 muscle fibers are very efficient, and They don't fatigue very easily. They utilize oxygen really well.
Those are the running muscles,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So endurance
Endurance
athletes
yeah.
have very efficient type 1 muscle fibers.
And that's why they're not like bulky. You'll see runners, they're more thin, lean, and they're more because they have a lot of type 1 muscle fibers. Is that correct?
So not only are the motor units smaller in type 1 muscle fibers, but the fibers themselves are smaller. And they don't need quite as many of those contractile, those actin and myosin molecules. They're there to, be able to provide a ton of energy for those endurance type sports. So they have a lot of mitochondria within them. We've talked about mitochondria in other podcasts, so I won't go into too much of the biochemistry here, but mitochondria provide us with a ton of energy. It just takes a little longer to get that energy. And so it makes sense when you think of a type 1 muscle fiber having a lot of mitochondria and being so efficient in endurance athletes. It makes sense. I mean, they're not sprinting all out and getting that energy really quick. They're going at a slower pace, but able to maintain it for a longer period of time. But yeah, the motor units are also smaller there. And then we get into type 2 fibers. Type 2 is broken into there's two different types of type 2. There's type 2A and there's type 2B. You may have heard people talk about type 2X. That isn't true. If someone says there's a type 2X fiber, that isn't true in humans. We found type 2X fibers in animals like a cheetah has type 2X fibers, and bears have type 2X fibers. These fibers are like just straight up glycolytic, or what we call anaerobic, and do not need oxygen, or they don't have a lot of mitochondria, but they're so fast to contract. I point that out because I think that's a common misconception in exercise physiology. People think there's type 2X. There hasn't been type 2X identified in humans. We have what's called type 2B. Type 2A and B, so how they work, you've got type 1, type 2A, and then type 2B. Type 2A is kind of in between type 1 and type 2B. It has mitochondria and is able to go through oxidative phosphorylation, kind of able to participate in those endurance events, but it is also very anaerobic. It provides you with that quick feel, and it will grow in size. The motor units that innervate type 2A fibers are also much larger, and you get a lot more strength, a lot more power from these muscle fibers, but they fatigue easier than type 1 muscle fibers. And then type 2B fibers are just further on that spectrum of much more power, easier fatigue, less mitochondria.
So like power lifters, they would have a lot of type 2B.
Yeah. What's interesting though about the type 2B is it doesn't seem to be, there's not evidence to suggest that you can actually increase type 2B muscle fibers. There may be this genetic component to type 2B specifically, where some people just have more type 2B, but the cool thing is you can increase these type 2A muscle fibers to be more like strength, power. We may uncover that as data unfold, but right now it seems to be that like these type 2B are more genetic in nature, and you're not really able to influence them.
Oh, wow.
But so let me think. That is the summary of like
the muscle fibers,
the muscle anatomy.
Yeah.
And I hope that wasn't too much of like a confusing picture, but it should start to make sense as we start talking about, like how the muscle functions and how it influences other aspects of your life.
Can we talk about like muscle metabolism for like resistance training and cardio? Is there differences, or are you going to get the same effect? Like obviously if you do more cardio, you're going to get more type 1 fibers, but like what does it do to your metabolism?
Yeah. So,
or what if you cross train both?
Yeah. When you think of like cardio versus strength training and muscle metabolism specifically. So we talked about how type 1 muscle fibers are really anaerobic. They're really good at breaking down fatty acids and glucose and bringing them into the mitochondria and producing just a shit ton of energy versus type 2 muscle fibers. Now, metabolism, if you're thinking like how does muscle specifically increase metabolism? Now, I'm going to kind of paint this picture in a couple different ways before we go into resistance and cardio, because I want to highlight the importance of muscle in metabolism.
Yeah.
Now, some people get really obsessed with this idea of doing cardio, thinking that it's going to help them lose weight. Everyone just hops on the treadmill for like a super long time thinking, look, this is the best way to lose weight. I'm going to go for 4 hours on the treadmill until I sweat and feel like I'm going to pass out. And then, So, but what's actually interesting is I talked about myosin and how much energy myosin uses. I mean, we just had Zach on the podcast, doctoral candidate Zach Roloff, where he breaks down how muscle is so metabolically active, and a lot of it comes down to myosin and how much energy these myosin molecules use. And people that are sedentary, if you don't do endurance training or resistance training, you're not activating these motor units. They kind of just sit dormant. Your body doesn't need to use them. And so if you're not activating muscle, it's not going to be utilizing that energy, right? And so if you have more muscle, you have more of those motor units innervating, more muscle fibers, you have this increase in metabolic rate. And so resistance training plays a huge role in your day-to-day metabolic rate. If you have more muscles, you're going to be burning more calories per day because of how much energy they use. And as far as like what does it do to different muscle fibers, so we can get into cardio versus resistance training. Resistance training, hands down, is going to be better for calorie expenditure, weight loss. You'll see yourself gaining weight right away because you're putting on muscle. But over time, you're going to be so much more metabolically healthy.
It really deters people when they start weightlifting. They're like, why am I not seeing results? Why am I gaining weight?
Yeah.
They don't know that their muscle weighs more than fat.
Right.
Which I feel like most people should know now, but it gets really... I saw that a lot when I was a trainer.
Yeah. I just feel like throw away the scale. Yeah. Especially at the beginning.
Just like take a picture before you start working out and just kind of see it's going to take time. It's not going to be 2-3 workouts. It's going to be extended amount of time, but you will notice a difference.
Yeah.
And everybody that's taking a picture beforehand that I tell them to do that, they always like at first they're hesitant. They're like, I don't want to take a picture of myself. But then you notice the changes. Even though if you don't see it in the mirror, you'll know in the pictures.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a really good point. And I feel like people should follow it in that direction because
just throw that scale.
Yeah. I mean, people are just so obsessed with weight loss. That's why these like GLP-1 agonists are blowing up, and pharmaceutical companies are making just a shit ton of money off them. It's because that's all that people care about is how much weight they lose. But I'm here to tell you, like, you should care about how much muscle you have. If you're, overweight and have a lot of muscle, you're so much healthier than somebody who is way underweight or skinny and has no muscle. I guarantee you will live a longer and healthier life for sure, 10 times out of 10. And so what were we talking about? Difference between cardio and strength training?
Strength training, metabolism.
Yeah. So with strength training, you get more muscle, you recruit more of those motor units. So muscle recruitment, that's what that is. You're recruiting more muscles. If you're not doing resistance training, you never need to recruit those muscles. You can run on the treadmill all you want, but you're not going to pull on those type 2 muscle fibers because your body doesn't need them unless you're running sprints at an incline. And even then, you're still missing out on this aspect of resistance training that can pull on more muscle, so recruit more muscle, increase the size of those muscles, increase the metabolic rate, and improve your metabolic health. And type 1 muscle fibers are still important, though. They're still burning a lot of energy. So even if you just do cardio, you're going to raise your metabolic rate. You're going to increase energy utilization. And it's interesting, though, when you look into the research on resistance training and what that does to different aspects of our health, you see that like there's a recent paper that came out looking at resistance training only in patients with type 2 diabetes and how like it significantly improves A1C, insulin sensitivity, and can reverse these symptoms of diabetes. Well, the reason is because muscle is it's so heavily involved in your whole body's metabolism. Muscle is a phenomenal place to store glucose. Diabetes is this disease of excess glucose and insulin resistance. So insulin is what takes care of the glucose in your bloodstream. Your body maintains this crazy consistent level of glucose. If it gets too high or too low, predisposes you to a variety of diseases. We've touched on this in another podcast. I won't go on this tangent. But so muscle can take up that glucose, and it actually doesn't even need insulin to do that. It's what's called insulin independent glucose disposal. So just contracting muscle will pull in glucose. And over time, you don't need as much insulin. You become more insulin sensitive, which is a good thing. That means that your cells are more sensitive to insulin. This happens across the whole body. And so muscle is able to have an influence on insulin sensitivity, dispose of glucose there. And so it's improving metabolic health. And this is very clear in the literature. And so like people that have metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, like just get some damn muscle and you're going to be Gucci.
Yeah, you can be Gucci. When do people start seeing, is there any research that shows like when people start getting rid of type 2 diabetes when they exercise? Like, how do you know that you don't have to take insulin anymore?
So,
like, does your body just tell you? This is just a curious question that I had. Like, I know a lot of people that do have type 2 diabetes, but like if they start working out, when will they know the effects of like, oh, I don't need to take this anymore? Like,
well, first off, I would say like don't just start resistance training and stop your insulin without like, consulting.
That's not what I was getting at. Yeah.
But like as far as how long would it take to get the effects here?
Yeah.
Most of the studies that look at like resistance training programs are around 6 weeks. There's like 4 to 8 week study interventions. And it's because we know that within that amount of time, you're going to see the adaptations that strength training bring. It's going to be different for everybody. But muscle can grow very quickly. And the cool thing about all these adaptations is they happen quicker if you're untrained.
Yeah.
So if you're going from being sedentary, if you have no experience resistance training, then I am just jealous because like you can gain muscle so much faster than somebody who has been resistance training their whole life and goes through the same program. Like you have so much, your body's just waiting for that, basically. Like you've got everything, all the equipment is there. You just got to utilize it. And so that's the cool part. A lot of people with type 2 diabetes end up with type 2 diabetes because of being sedentary, excess calorie intake, and a variety of other influences to their metabolic health. And so most people that start a resistance training program that have type 2 diabetes will see those effects pretty quickly. And if you're using insulin, you're using it in tandem with checking your blood glucose level. So, if you were to approach your physician and you came up with a plan with them to check your blood glucose level, if you dialed back insulin and were able to completely come off insulin. The problem with like treatment of type 2 diabetes, this is another tangent, Reed. You're going to have to catch me.
No, I'm really curious. That question, like I've never thought about that until like this moment. Like how do people know when they're feeling better? Like, that's kind of what I was getting at. Cause I've never really thought about that until like right now.
Well,
cause like you can reverse the effects of type 2 diabetes by just doing exercise. Like, when do people like feel that? Like, I'm sure they'll know when they test their blood glucose levels, but that's just kind of just popped in my head. And it's like, maybe Luke knows more science about that.
Well,
which, you went in on that. So like,
I mean, that's
awesome.
That's the cool part about exercise. Like type 2 diabetes is one of those diseases you can completely treat with exercise. Like you can cure type 2 diabetes with exercise. Yeah, it's crazy. But it is not curable with diabetes medications, especially insulin. So insulin, your body's in this state of not responding very well to insulin and glucose levels increase. And so our response in the medical field is, well, let's just pump them with more insulin.
Yeah.
And then hopefully those cells will listen and they'll dispose of that glucose. Well, what happens when you continue to pump insulin is, one, you impact the pancreas's production of insulin. And I should clarify, we're talking type 2 diabetes here versus type 1, where type 1, you have the inability to produce insulin in the pancreas. Type 2 diabetes, you're still insulin production is still there.
Yeah.
So when you're giving insulin, you're influencing the pancreas's production of insulin. You're also influencing those cells. If there's so much insulin, those receptors, they're called GLUT4 receptors from the muscle specifically. There's other GLUT receptors on different cells because all cells are, going to be utilizing glucose. But those GLUT4 receptors, if there's so much insulin present, they're going to become less responsive to the insulin to take in glucose. So you're kind of just like worsening the process of this disease just to treat these symptoms. And that's an issue with so much in healthcare. It's like
Yeah.
we're just basically putting a Band-Aid on the symptoms here instead of addressing the underlying issue. And that's why exercise is hands down the
Exercise
best
is
treatment.
medicine,
Yeah,
yeah.
hands down the best treatment for type 2 diabetes. I mean, that's just like a perfect example. I wasn't expecting that we would talk about this, but I'm glad we did.
But yeah, that's just really important because it's type 2 diabetes is just so rampant here.
Yeah.
So like I think that was very important for us to touch on. Let's go into like the effects of muscle has on the brain.
Ooh, this is
Is
a cool
brain a
area.
muscle? Like like exercising that just makes your brain more sharp, like kind of go in the science behind it.
So you can kind of think of the brain. I mean, the brain's not a muscle, but you can think of the brain as being similar in terms of it has what's called, there's a process called neuroplasticity, where there are certain aspects of your brain that you can improve with stimulation, just like you would with muscle. Let me just pull up the research on this because there was a recent paper that just came out. I want to make sure I'm citing it correctly. Oh, this is a different paper, but there's a cool review that was published back in 2022 that just summarizes so we know there's an influence of muscle on the brain. We just don't know, why is it that the muscle has this influence on cognitive function and on things like Alzheimer's and dementia. And we touched on that stuff in the Exercise versus Nutrition podcast on some of the epidemiology there, but I want to hit on it again because I think it's so interesting and so important. When you exercise, your muscle releases a bunch of these components called myokines. They're similar to, if you remember, we've talked about this too in other episodes of cytokines and like COVID, you got the cytokine storm. Well, immune cells will release these cytokines that start this immune process. It's basically this way of like communicating with other cells in the body. Well, your muscle does that too. And your muscle, through releasing these myokines, some of these myokines are able to go into the brain, cross the blood-brain barrier. So the muscle has this direct communication with the brain and increases production of what's called brain-derived neurotropic factor, or BDNF. And BDNF is involved in neuroplasticity, and it will improve cognitive function. You'll improve vascular function in the brain, which is one of these things that we think is related to all these neurodegenerative related diseases like Alzheimer's and other things that cause dementia, is you get this impairment in blood flow and you actually start to atrophy parts of the brain. So brain volume will go down. Well, through resistance training specifically, you preserve brain volume, you preserve that blood flow to the brain, you increase brain-derived neurotropic factors. So it plays a huge role in dementia and Alzheimer's. And that research is very clear in terms of like people, you can directly correlate the amount of muscle mass somebody has to their likelihood of getting Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. And that's just one area. There's another area of research, a recent meta-analysis that came out on the role of resistance training as a treatment for depression and anxiety. And I mean treatment. So this paper just recently came out, published in May. It was published in Early Intervention in Psychology journal. It's a systematic review of randomized controlled trials. And they looked at all the research we have on resistance training and showed that it was able to significantly improve symptoms of depression and anxiety to the level of like, you can use resistance training as a treatment for these diseases. I mean, how incredible is that?
So you're not just taking medication as a Band-Aid, like exercise can get rid of those symptoms of depression.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And this isn't to say like it's like curing this disease, but it's a treatment for these diseases. I mean, maybe we'll see more research in terms of like a long-term cure using resistance training, but it's pretty incredible. And you don't have to take medications. That's a huge thing in this field because there's different classes of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, those are the big ones. There's also monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MOAs. When you get started on this class of medication, everyone responds differently to them. And it takes like 4 weeks to figure out if this medication is working. And if it's not, you got to start on a new one. It takes another 4 weeks. And you're messing around with these, catecholamines in your brain that we've talked about in other podcasts that have an influence in connecting to different neurons in your brain. Anytime you're influencing these, you can have an impact on the receptor sensitivity. And, it's just one of those things like, if you can do an alternative to a pharmaceutical intervention, you should do that
I'm
10
all
times
for it.
out of
Yeah.
10 if it works, right?
Yeah.
And so resistance training is one of those things. And this is just a cool recent meta-analysis and systematic review of meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, May of 2024. I mean, this paper was just published showing, yeah, actually, this could be used as a treatment for depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
So it seems to have an influence on the brain, Reed, is what I'm thinking.
Actually, yeah, I was going to say, like, it's good for your brain, metabolism. How about immune system?
Yeah, this is a cool area of research in terms of like the communication with the immune system. I mean, it makes perfect sense though when you think of like the immune cells releasing cytokines. Are we playing footsie or what am I touching?
That's not me.
Oh, it's just something under the table. It's like, wow, this is great. Well, do you want to play footsie?
I mean,
I can't really reach you. So immune cells, we talked about releasing cytokines, right?
Yeah.
Well, muscle releases these myokines, which are essentially the same thing in this like ability to communicate with other cells. Well, one of those myokines is interleukin 6. Interleukin 6 is almost this like universal marker of communicating to other cells. And most research suggests it as like a pro-inflammatory marker, but really it's a way of communicating and recruiting other cells of the immune system. And so muscle releases that. And if you think about it in terms of what's happening when you damage muscle, you need to recruit immune cells into that muscle to get rid of any damaged tissue and to help with the process of regeneration. So your muscle has to be able to be like, yo, immune system, I'm going to need some help because that was a pretty hard workout. We're going to have to build back stronger. And the immune system is involved in that process. So, of course, the muscle would have to have a communication to it or with it, right? And then there's plenty of research into like resistance training and what that does to like specific immune cell functions. So you see that like certain immune cell populations, their ability to respond to infections is enhanced just from like one bout of strength training. So you're basically just like you're mobilizing more immune cells in your body and you're improving their function. And so when you're strength training, you're basically just like waking up the immune system to be like, hey, I'm going to need some help, but while you're out here, if we're sick or anything, go take care of that too. That kind of thing.
So we should get gyms at hospitals, basically.
Yeah. I mean, that's like the point of all this shit, right?
Just, hey, you're sick. Let's get you on a little bike or let's get you, here's some weights. Just start lifting while you're in your bed. Like, I know a lot of people can't because they're like extremely sick, but like think about the benefits to having like a gym there. People that can get up or just having some like a trainer or somebody going into your room and just doing exercises to get that blood moving, help improve your immune system, dude, because it's already beaten up with all the medications you're taking. Holy,
that's a whole okay. Well,
whoa,
that area of research you got to check out. This study, and actually, I posted it on our social media page where it was a hospital that was like, you look at the research in terms of when somebody stays inpatient or in the hospital for a while, their likelihood of returning to the hospital or their likelihood of having a decline in their condition, so being sicker, being in worse health and deteriorating, it increases exponentially when you're just staying there for a long time. Well, do you know why it increases exponentially? It's because of this loss in muscle mass.
Yeah.
That loss in muscle mass happens within a 2-week period at such a significant level to where it is influencing your immune system. It is influencing cognitive function. It is influencing all these aspects of your health. So when you're staying in the hospital, bedridden, not moving, you're losing muscle, you're getting sicker, you're not recovering as well. Then when you leave, you've got less muscle mass. And when we're thinking somebody that's over 60, your likelihood of having a fall at 60 isn't even that old. Your likelihood of having a fall that leads to fracture and that can lead to infection and can lead to death down the line, that increases substantially just with age.
Yeah.
Well, now let's think about it in terms of somebody who's just been in the hospital that's lost all this muscle that we then send home. And so there's this whole area of research showing the longer you're in the hospital, the more likely you're to come back to the hospital, and you're going to come back for these reasons that the hospital actually caused. And this isn't to say that it's because of the providers in the healthcare system.
Yeah.
Like, I want to point out that like
that's not how I perceive that at all.
But I want to point it out just so that it's not
Other
taken, because
people's
I think people could take that message in a lot of ways. Well,
They could, yeah.
what I do want to point out is like the hospital is absolutely essential, and you need the hospital. And the hospital has saved more lives than I can, anything that I can even imagine in terms of acute infection, trauma, accidents, fractures. I mean, you can't do without the care that a hospital provides. But this growing area of research is just showing one spot that we can improve within our hospital system. And so this whole area of research showing the longer you're hospitalized, the worse it is for you. Like, hospitals are a dangerous place to be for a long time. Yeah, get out of there. But if you are going to be in there for a long time, there's this lab that looked at if they were to, there's a whole initiative, and I'm blanking on the name of it. It has something to do with pajamas. Like, basically, like, let's get people out of their gowns and into like a pair of pajamas or something when they're in the hospital, so that they can get up and move easier. But they looked at if we have patients that are staying for a prolonged period of time in the hospital, if we give them like a bike that they can use in the bed for patients that can't get up and move, just to move their legs. And then you can even do just full body movement exercises to activate those muscles. And if you can get up, you walk around. Exactly. So like banded exercise.
Yeah.
And they showed that if you did this in the hospital, you were able to preserve muscle mass. So you don't have that decline in muscle mass while you're staying. Your health is better than baseline because you've just been treated for whatever infection or why ever you were there. And then when you leave, you don't have this risk of returning anymore. And so I'm hoping very soon that's just standard of care, where you go into a patient's room, and if they're there for longer than a day, if they're there overnight, it's like, oh, let's get them set up for their workout. That's going to be at this time.
It's
this
built
is what
into
they're
their
going to
plan.
do.
Yep.
And it's just part of the process of care, but it is totally not. And like working inpatient, I go into these patients' rooms, and it's like, you see them the first day, and then you see them the next day. And then if they're there for a long time, you can just see them declining because they're on all these medications. They haven't moved. And when you're sitting in a hospital bed that you're getting checked on all the time, there's all these noises, you can't sleep well. And we've already talked about sleep. Listen to that podcast in terms of like, if you're messing up someone's sleep, what's that going to do to their health? But you've got all this interruption. You're not at home. Your circadian rhythm gets all out of whack, and you're not moving. It's just insane how much of an impact that has. And before we go to the next subject, I do want to bring up, they also in that study had a nutrition intervention where they basically just bumped up protein intake for those individuals too, and showed that was able to help in combination with the exercise to preserve muscle.
Oh my goodness.
So like, we should just be given protein we should just be given protein and doing exercise for these people.
Putting in workout routines into their plan. Oh my goodness.
I don't know why it's not a thing.
Dude. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's
like you just
really
solved
cool area
something that, like, I mean, they have PTs there that do exercise,
but not everyone has
specific.
PT.
Yeah, mostly it's specific. They're specific on like their injury, trying to get that back up to normal, like a knee injury or something. But if you just do a total body, just move, the benefits, and you just rebounding after that hospital visit, that's insane.
I mean, and like you brought up PT. PT is great. They're getting them up and moving and doing this stuff, but PT is only there when they're consulted.
Yeah.
And so like, we should just have PT for every single patient. I'm sure you talk to any PT, they would agree with that exact statement. It's like, it's not that does this patient need PT or not. It's just, when can they do their PT is how it should be. Because physical therapists, like, they have the exercise physiology training to do just generalized exercise physiology or exercise programming, or they should at least.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't have to be injury specific. It can be
get moving.
Yeah. Just get moving and
boost that immune system.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Are there any other health impacts that muscle has on the body that we haven't touched up on yet before we move forward?
Literally freaking everything.
Everything?
So like,
all of it.
As it relates to, we've talked about type 2 diabetes. Well, metabolic disease and obesity and all these obesity related conditions. So somebody that has obesity is predisposed to everything.
Yeah.
Name the disease, obesity increases your risk of developing that disease, or what we call comorbidities. So being obese is just horrible for your health. And obese is not your weight. I want to highlight that too. Like I talked about, if you have more muscle and you're considered obese because of your BMI, that's just addressing your weight. But if you have more muscle and you're overweight, you're actually not obese. You're metabolically healthy. But what's happening in those instances is you have this accumulation of fat within the liver, and you develop what's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD, because of all this excess energy and all this excess glucose that your liver takes up and goes through what's called de novo lipogenesis, where it'll convert that glucose into fatty acids and it'll store it. I saw a yawn starting there, Reed. Is this getting too deep?
I yawn?
Oh, maybe you're just taking a deep breath.
Deep breath.
Okay. I was like, oh God, am I going? Yeah, this guy's going on a tangent again. Shut him up. You just slap me if you need to. So de novo lipogenesis. You have to, store all this fat within the cell in the liver, and that inhibits the liver cell's ability to go through fat oxidation. So if you're making fat, you're not burning fat. You store excess fat in the liver. All these triglycerides that are made through de novo lipogenesis get packaged in all these cholesterol molecules, increases cholesterol, increases fat accumulation, and basically those effects down the line have this influence on every aspect of your overall metabolic health. Your liver is what's kind of like regulating the environment for the rest of the body. And in terms of like spitting out fuel, spitting out glucose, your liver doesn't actually use a lot of glucose, but it regulates, glucose and triglycerides for the rest of the body. So when you get all this fat accumulation, you impair the liver's ability to regulate fuel, and then you end up with metabolic disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes. All these diseases can kind of be traced back to this excess energy, fat accumulation within the liver, and other organs. You get fat accumulation in the muscle, you get fat accumulation in the pancreas as well. And why did I go down that line again? Oh, what other aspects of your health? Yeah, so when you have more muscle, you're creating a reserve for that glucose. You're improving metabolic health. You're increasing mitochondrial content. You're increasing the enzymes that are involved in breaking down fat. You're increasing the enzymes that are involved in building up, protein or building up components of the cell. You're basically just adding this helper for the liver and adding this helper for the rest of the body. And so like the muscle is, if you don't have muscle, then you're just you're being a jerk to your liver is what you're doing. Be nice to your liver. So it has an influence on your liver, your pancreas. There's also this cool area of research showing that resistance training has an influence on the gut microbiome. We talked about this in the Exercise versus Nutrition podcast. The mechanisms remain to be discovered, but we know that people who exercise, their microbiome diversity is improved. And so really the question should be, what doesn't the muscle do? Like in your cardiovascular system, when you're resistance training, you're improving blood vessel response. You're actually like opening up these blood vessel channels, just like you are recruiting more muscles. You're recruiting more blood vessels. You increase total blood volume. Cardiovascular function improves like
VO2
crazy.
max goes up.
VO2 max goes up. Yeah. So
that would have been a better question.
Yeah. What the hell does muscle not do? It's really the thing.
Can't find anything.
Yeah.
All right, now let's go into Reed's Reddit finds. So I looked up just some basic stuff about muscle, like people's questions that they had. I got a couple of them today, not the best, not the cream of the crop, but I got some solid ones that I think people would be interested in. My first question is, what age does muscle mass volume decline?
Oh, that's actually
males and females.
Funny that you asked that question. Let me pull up. There was a paper that was just published where they looked at DEXA scans, which is you often get a DEXA scan to see if you have osteopenia or osteoporosis. They'll look at the bone mineral density, or the density within your bones. And it also tells you how much muscle mass you have and how much fat you have. And they looked at across different age groups. And what they found was, this was just published July 1st. So last week, at the time of recording this. And what they found is that muscle peaks in your mid-20s and then kind of maintains the same level until your 50s, and then there's a steady drop, and then right around your mid-70s, we see that just fall off a cliff. But you have this steady decline in your 50s. And this is just related to muscle mass. You actually see strength and speed and power decrease even quicker than that. And
so the old man strength is not a thing?
Old man strength is not a thing.
Oh, what?
Yeah. So it's actually the opposite. So what's interesting, but it doesn't have to be the opposite.
Oh, okay.
So we don't yet know what comes first in terms of, is it because you're less active when you're older that leads you to having less muscle and less strength? Or is it because, or are you less active because you have less muscle and less strength? It's pointing towards it's because you're not active, you're not doing strength training. And so if you don't use it, you lose it, that type of thing.
Yeah.
That seems to be where we're headed in this area of research. And the reason I say that is because there's a really cool study that came out at the end of 2023 where they, this was a randomized controlled trial. They grouped people into like young individuals less than 80, but still old. It was like 65 to 80, and then 80 and above did 3 months of resistance training 3 times per week and showed that resistance training was able to improve the conformation of those muscle fibers and the function there. They basically they had adaptations to resistance training like the young individuals did.
Yeah.
Versus people that were sedentary, they had their muscle fibers start to like change shape and kind of warp and not function correctly. And then you also get this process with aging where I talked about type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers and how our motor units influence those. Now, your motor unit only innervates one type of muscle fiber. Each motor unit innervates only one type. So you can't have a motor unit or nerves that innervate both type 1 and type 2. Whatever that motor unit is what those muscle fiber types are. So as you get old, if you're not training those type 2 muscle fibers, if you're not doing sprinting or anything like fast or resistance training, what happens with those nerves is they actually start to pull away. So I use that analogy of like your fingertips innervating a bunch of muscles. Well, if your nerves don't need to be there, those nerves will pull away, and sometimes they'll like latch on to type 1 muscle fibers because those are smaller, it's a little easier. And so you'll see this shift as you get older of way less type 2 muscle fibers, way more type 1 muscle fibers. Okay. And that's why old people, they have so much less stability. When you fall or when you trip, those type 2 muscle fibers are very quick. They're going to catch you.
Yep.
Older people have much more of a risk of falling.
Because they have less type 2.
Yeah, they're losing all these type 2 muscle fibers. And then you get this crazy, like if you're pulling away from type 2 muscle fibers and you're kind of, those neurons are joining on with the other motor units with type 1 muscle fibers, what you end up seeing is you'll get this whole muscle. Like think of a quad muscle. You'll see like muscles active just in one part of it, as opposed to like nice and spread out throughout the muscle. And so just like one part of the muscle is contracting, and that just messes up your ability to contract those muscles. You know what I mean? And so you see this decline in muscle size, and it makes perfect sense that it's related to resistance training. And it makes perfect sense that like, if you're losing type 2 muscle fibers, that's where all that size is. That's where all that strength is. And so if you don't do strength training, your body's not going to keep those muscle fibers. It's just going to be like, well, all they do is just walk around, stand up. So I'm just going to use type 1 muscle fibers
for falling because
and that's what happens. And so that's what we see with age. But you're never too old. So that study I mentioned with that in the late 2023 study of people that are 80, there's another paper showing that these adaptations happen 85 and above. Like no matter how old you are, you can influence your muscle. You can improve muscle mass. You can improve strength. We used to think that wasn't the case, that you get to a point where like you're not going to have these adaptations, but the literature over the last few years has been awesome and really pointed to like, it doesn't matter how old you are. You're going to get the benefit, and you absolutely should start. It's never too late.
Never too late. And then my second question is, why is it harder to add muscle mass as we age? Say like we turn 60, like why is it harder for people that are older? I mean, we kind of touched upon in the last question, but like why is it harder for people to gain muscle mass? Just because they're more frail, they've turned to the type 1, so it's a little harder to get to the type 2? Is there a truth to this question? Or
so you can kind of think of that question as like, what happens to overall physiological function in our body as we age, processes of like our metabolic function, our ability to go through protein synthesis, all these things are reduced with age, but it doesn't mean they can't be improved. So you can get to the point where you resemble somebody who's, in their mid-20s at this peak performance. You can get there when you're in your 60s. It just takes a little bit longer because all these processes are impaired as we age. But it doesn't mean you can't get there.
Yeah. So it'd be like an older car, like an old muscle car. Like you can still put a nice engine in there.
Oh, wait, Game of Thrones.
Oh.
Who's the old person? No. Ooh, who's that guy that just like the best fighter, old guy? He gets like kicked out of King's Landing, but he's awesome. He ends up like he dies in the like towards the end.
Oh, is he a Targaryen? Is he the guy?
Yeah. But he didn't know he was a, or no, he knew he was a Targaryen, but they just didn't.
His brother was the Mad King.
Yeah. Who was that guy?
Is it Aemon?
Aemon.
I think it's Aemon.
Well,
I just watched him die the other day. So sad.
Well, him, like he's still like able to compete with the best of them, right?
He's blind.
Did we find that out at the end?
He was blind the whole time.
No, I know, but we didn't know that until the end? No, then that's not who I was thinking of.
Oh, you're not thinking of that person?
But I think he was a Targaryen. He had some sort of claim to the throne. I would
probably say, not Tyrion, the dad. He was older, but he could fight in battle. And he was fighting with the young guys. Like he's fighting with Jaime, he's fighting with everybody. Like they won. It
just takes a little more.
It just takes more.
Yeah.
But you can still get there.
You just got to train. But imagine if he was just some old guy from King's Landing that they grabbed off the streets. Like he's not going to have it.
No. Like he trained to be up there. He's on horseback. He's charging Stannis. Like, yeah.
Game of Thrones.
Muscle car would have been easier.
It was like, you got to shut up with the Game of Thrones. Your analogies are just getting horrible. No, we're going to force it on every episode. We're going to force multiple.
So the last question I got here is, what are the risks of having low muscle as you age? Like, what are the risks of having lower muscle, like not working out? I mean, we kind of touched up on it on everything, but that's just one of their questions on here that I had.
Yeah. I mean, it's multifold, and it goes back to what we were talking about. But so think about it. Like, if you have less muscle, one of the it's not even interesting because it's obvious. There's an area of research in just like correlating sarcopenia. So that's the process of losing muscle with age, and showing that you can directly correlate sarcopenia to quality of life. Mm-hmm. And there's these validated quality of life surveys that we can really get an idea of how, somebody's overall well-being. And it is so clear that you can just point to, if you have more muscle mass, your quality of life is improved as you age. And it makes sense, right? I mean, think of if you had less muscle mass, you can't do the things you were used to be able to do. You can't pick up your grandkids. You can't, go on that trip you wanted to go to. And when you can't do those things, you imagine how that makes you feel about yourself and about your day-to-day living, and your functional capacity is impaired. So that's just an easy way to think of okay, one, it's just going to make you feel shitty, and the evidence there is very clear. But two, your ability to move is impaired. Your ability to catch yourself when you fall, so you're at an increased risk of fracture. I didn't hit on this about how muscle is essential for bone. Bone, you lose bone mineral density as you age.
After 26.
But the way, it is, and remember how I said mid-20s is the peak muscle? So you lose bone, and the way to preserve bone mineral density or improve bone mineral density is through resistance training. Mm-hmm. You have to place load on that bone for it to adapt.
Strengthen, yeah.
And muscles are what provide that ability of the bone. So if you lose muscle, you lose bone mineral density, you're more at risk of fracture. When you do get a fracture, you're not going to be able to recover from that fracture as well. So that's why when older people go in with like a hip fracture, they die from a hip fracture, from an infection, the things that happen because their body isn't able to recover properly.
Yep.
So your recovery is impaired. You're more at risk of injury. You're more at risk of infection because you don't have that muscle to directly communicate, mobilize, activate those immune cells. Your cardiovascular system is impaired. You don't have that capacity to increase blood volume, redirect blood flow. Your metabolic function is impaired. You're more at risk of type 2 diabetes, obesity, all these conditions that we talked about with excess fuel partitioning. You're more at risk of dementia-related conditions because you don't have that influence to the brain as optimally as you would with muscle. So again, the question would be like, what doesn't suck for old people that don't have muscle? Think of an old person, and when I say old, just however you view old, do you think there's anyone who has ever said, shit, I wish I had a little bit less muscle?
I don't think I've heard that one.
Yeah, no, it doesn't exist. Like, go out and get yourself as much muscle as you can. You will never regret it. Yeah. When you're older, it is going to have such a profound influence on your quality of life and overall health.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you won't regret it. If you're someone old out there and you're like, gosh, stupid muscle, wish I had less of it, let me know.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear from you.
Love to hear from you.
Maybe I'm wrong.
What are the best ways to build and maintain muscle?
Lift,
yeah. Are there taking protein, creatine, people that take steroids, what happens to all of that? Protein is essential, like you're saying in the medical setting. Getting your protein in and working out, huge for your health and getting out of the hospital. But how do you just maintain it? And what's the frequency that you should be working out?
Yeah, we'll get much more into the frequency on the next podcast where we talk specifically how do you build muscle and such. But what's interesting about this area of research, and I posted this on our social media page too, about a recent study that was published showing that you only need to target each muscle group once per week to maintain whatever adaptations you have. You shouldn't lose strength muscle mass if you target once per week that muscle group. So that's huge for people going on vacations and stuff, because you kind of fall off the wagon when you're on vacation, because if you're working out 3 to 5 times per week and then you go on vacation and you stop, you come back and you're like, I lost everything, and then you lose motivation.
Yeah.
Well, if you can just do one full body workout on one day while you're on vacation, you're going to come back and you're not going to have lost any muscle mass. Yep. You're not going to have lost strength. So that's what's kind of cool. So for maintenance, you just got to make sure you're targeting each major muscle group once in a week. Obviously, you're going to do more to build, but we'll touch on that in the other podcast or next week's podcast. Now, as far as supplements go, you can't build muscle and you can't maintain muscle if you don't have protein. Your muscle goes through what's called protein turnover. So it's breaking down and building protein constantly. So much protein is getting broken down, and you need so much more protein to rebuild. So if you don't have the protein there to build, you're not going to build and you're going to break down.
Yeah.
And so protein's huge. You asked about creatine. Creatine is there. We have this anaerobic fuel source, creatine phosphate. So there's a phosphate bound to a creatine. When doctoral candidate Zach Roloff, when he was on here and we were talking about how ATP is that currency of the cell. Well, there's ADP, so adenosine diphosphate instead of adenosine triphosphate. That creatine phosphate can just toss its phosphate group to ADP and turn it into ATP, and the cell can utilize it immediately for energy. So creatine kind of helps with that process and gives you more of that anaerobic reserve capacity to go through more high intensity, more strength training. There's also a really cool area of research in creatine and how that influences cognitive health and such. That's a topic for another podcast. But if we're talking muscle specifically, that tends to be what people rely on creatine for, is that energy to help them push harder in a given workout.
I don't want to go too deep on creatine, but is it for everyone? Could my mom take creatine?
Yeah.
Would it be healthy for her? She obviously doesn't want to be a bodybuilder, but I take creatine every single day.
Yeah.
And I've noticed my muscle maintaining, even if I can only get to the gym 3 days a week with a crazy busy family and everything going on. But I've noticed my muscle strength is maintained while taking it, and like the clarity in my clarity in like my brain too. Like it just feels like I have more energy for my brain, and I'm just more focused. I don't know if it's a placebo thing, but like I definitely feel all those benefits that you just said.
Well, and so to answer the question of could your mom take it? Could anyone take it?
Yeah, could anyone?
Creatine's one of those areas of research, along with protein and like caffeine even, that it's like, it's just showing more and more and more benefits as the research continue to come out.
Yeah.
And there are not any contraindications to creatine supplementation, no matter your age group. And I think people get a little worried about creatine and like creatinine that we look at in a medical setting. So our creatinine level gives us an idea of somebody's kidney function. If creatinine levels increase, it tells us that kidney function might be impaired.
Yeah.
And so people are like, oh, you increase creatine down the line, you could have an effect on creatinine. I've heard that claim made a lot, even in like a medical setting.
Yeah.
But creatinine isn't the reason our kidney's impaired. It's just a metric to tell us that our kidney is impaired. And so it's not a causative factor, if that makes sense. And so like there isn't that risk. And I know there's like, it's similar to protein. I mean, for me growing up, when I was taking creatine, I mean, in high school when I got really into lifting and protein and creatine, and I know my mom was concerned about like, oh, you shouldn't be taking that. And I'd like hear that all the time. And then I thought that, and it's like, no, you look into the research, we're yet to see any negative impacts of creatine. And the amount of positive impacts it has, especially as we get into like dementia. Now this area of research is unfolding, and it's like, oh, creatine supplementation could have an influence on cognitive function, especially in patients with dementia.
I saw that on my Instagram reels. Like someone said that same thing. I'm like, this needs to be talked about more. Like there's no side effects to it.
Exactly.
And all the benefits you get. And to get that amount, like a 5 milligram scoop of monohydrate, you'd have to eat a bunch of meat to get that amount. So just supplementing with that 5 milligram once a day goes a long way.
Exactly. Definitely. And you don't have to worry about like the loading and deloading phase. Just get your 5 milligrams and you'll be great. And anyone can do it. It's not going to,
That's
so.
What about is too much muscle a bad thing? Like those guys that take steroids that are just jacked. Like one of my friend's moms back in the day was like, don't get too much muscle because then you'll be fat later in life. And then I was like all scared. I was like, no, what? That's probably because it's inactive, but that's just what has been ingrained in my head. It's just like, don't get too much muscle now because when you get older, it's going to be fat.
No, that's just like, I don't understand all the like concern behind lifting weights. Like, especially with like, kids are like, oh, it's going to stunt your growth. It's like, no, actually, it turns out it might do the opposite. It might help you with development and growth and things. And like, like that. Don't get too much muscle. You're going to get fat.
Like, later in life.
That's so not true. Like, there is absolutely no risk to having more muscle. Like, sure, you can get into people that are like professional bodybuilders that having this crazy amount of muscle mass, I imagine, could have an influence on mobility. And like, you're not going to want to do that. And when we're talking like steroids specifically, so excess steroid utilization can impact your body's steroid production. And if you're, people that use steroids, you need to do it in a safe way to where you're not having an impact on your body's ability to produce and utilize and not having an impact on receptor sensitivity in your body. And there are like safe ways to do that, and people do them safely and don't have health impacts. The problem is that people take anabolic steroids because they're like, oh, I just want to get jacked. And then, you overdo it, and then you do run risk of health concerns and such. But as far as like muscle specifically, it's not because you've increased muscle mass. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Are there any other interesting studies that we should talk about before wrapping up here today?
So this is just like a funny time of recording. And actually, some of your questions you asked about these, but within like the last week, there's been a few really cool papers that have popped up. So, one cool paper is, well, we kind of touched on that. Just last week, there was a paper that came out just looking at muscle fiber changes and how slow twitch fibers, there's not much happening within the fiber itself as far as like function, and how it looks and how it behaves and the amount of these type 1 muscle fibers, it's all just happened in those type 2 muscle fibers. So it's just an additional paper that was published showing and confirming that. Another epidemiology study that came out a few weeks ago. This is in the Journal of Epidemiology, and it was just looking back on, this was what's called a retrospective cohort study, and they found that people who had more muscle mass had a decreased risk of mortality for cancer and cardiovascular disease, and then overall mortality.
Yeah.
And again, this is an area, we know this, it's just pointing to like, this research is still coming out, and like we're still seeing every time you do these studies, you find consistent results of like increased muscle mass, increased strength. And actually, strength is a greater predictor of mortality than muscle mass specifically.
So it's kind of like taking a VO2 max is just testing how strong you are.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So strength is the most important metric here. Muscle mass goes hand in hand with strength. Yeah. But, you know, you look at a bodybuilder, somebody with just a crazy amount of muscle mass, you know, they're not even as close to as strong as somebody who's in like powerlifting, for example. And so they're not perfectly intertwined. And we're going to talk about that in the podcast, in the next podcast. But strength is the most important metric you can measure along with VO2 max. And we touched on this in the other one about VO2 max or the other episode, where the reason is it takes you so long to increase strength and to increase VO2 max that it tells you if you have high strength or VO2 max, that tells you how much time you've put in to being active. But it makes sense in another situation too, where like having more strength improves health more than just having more muscle because of things like mobility and fracture risk and that. That was that.
All right. In summary of the whole thing, what I really got is it's almost impossible to find muscle mass. There's anything wrong with it. There's any negatives to it. That's basically what I gathered from this. Like, keep working out. Good for your bone density, your brain, immune system, metabolism. Get in the gym. Get those type 2 muscle fibers so you can catch yourself when you're older so you don't fall and hurt yourself. Just, it's good for everything. Like,
get yoked.
That's what I got from this. If you guys didn't get that from this podcast, you weren't listening. You were doing something else.
Press repeat.
Yeah.
See, okay, that's exactly it. And it's so important to double click on that because people are like, oh, I'm going to be active and just do cardio. Everyone is so obsessed with cardio.
Always.
People are afraid to do strength training. And like, we talked about this before we even started recording about like how you had experience working with people who they're like, oh, I don't want to get too bulky. And like,
just want tone.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to lift weights because I don't want to be like a bodybuilder. And that shit doesn't happen by accident. You don't just like, oops, I all of a sudden got way too much muscle. If it were that easy, I mean, like, we've been working our asses off and we can't,
can't get there.
Yeah, like we're trying so hard to improve muscle mass. You know how much work we put in to get that? Yeah, it doesn't just happen by accident. So for people that are like, oh, I don't lift weights because I don't want to be bulky, I promise you that won't happen if you don't want it to happen. But it's just like, this is to encourage people to do resistance training. If you're doing cardio and it's taking away from resistance training, you're doing it wrong. You can do both, but you have to spend as much time as possible lifting weights, gaining muscle, gaining strength. It doesn't have to be at a gym. You don't even have to lift weights. This can be body weight. This stuff can be done at home. You can use bands. And you know, we'll have some programs available here in the near future that you can follow to, you know, that are specific to your goals and specific to how much time you have and if you've got access to the gym or what you got at home. And we'll give you some tips on what things you should purchase to get the best bang for your buck.
I'm going to miss you.
I'm going to miss you too, Reed.
Joe, we miss you.
Yeah, Joe,
just
what the heck?
Chair over there, but...
We should have. Oh, we can download things onto the podcast, or we should have just had like a.
Oh yeah.
What about
Justin Jefferson?
Justin Jefferson, or just exercise. When I ask a question,
we should. All right, tune in next week. Let's learn how to grow those muscles.
All right, we'll miss you guys.
See ya.
Thanks again for tuning in to the Kickback Science Podcast. We love talking science with all of you, and if you feel the same, you can support us by subscribing, hitting that like button, and giving us a follow on our social media pages. Don't forget, you can submit questions through our website and in the comments section of all our social media. Have a good one, everyone.